You believe you have the right to approach me like that?" Every conversation died mid-sent. Every fork and coffee cup froze in midair. The biker's roar tore through the cafe, breaking the calm hum. Christina hardly had time to open her mouth before the cup came flying. It spun once more, steaming coffee all over her. The heat burned into her flesh, soaking through her uniform in seconds. A harsh hiss escaped her lips as she staggered back, her hand grasping the counter for balance. The burn was bad. Laughing erupted from the other side of the room. "Damn. Look at her," one of the bikers hooted, smacking his knee. "Didn't even flinch. Maybe she enjoys it." Rough. Christina's breath came hard. The agony gwed at her chest. But something hotter burned under. It anger. She ripped the soaked apron off the fabric, slapping against the floor. Her fingers curled around the empty cup, still warm from the coffee that had been inside it, and then, without a second's hesitation, she threw it right back. The ceramic smashed into her already grimy leather vest. Her smile disappeared. The cafe fell into an eerie silence. The elderly man seated at the corner booth lowered his newspaper. The young couple near the window exchanged wide-eyed glances. Even the humming of the coffee machine suddenly seemed distant, like the whole place was holding its breath. The bearded biker glanced down at his vest, watching the stain spread. He slowly looked back up at Christina. "Oh, you got some balls, huh?" His voice dropped an octave, slow and thick, with menace, one step forward, then another. "You think you can talk back to me?" His hand slipped inside his vest. The click of a blade locking into place echoed in the hush of the cafe. The man pulled out a folding knife, flipping it open with a practiced flick of his wrist. His two friends grinned, shifting their weight like wolves. About to pounce, Christina's heart pounded, but she stood her ground. Her burned skin throbbed, her fists clenched at her sides, but she refused to step back. Then the biker lunged. Christina's breath hitched, a sharp gasp escaped her lips as fear surged through her chest like ice. Her body reacted before her mind. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the worst. The cafe exploded into panic. Chairs scraped against the floor as people hurried away from their seats. A woman near the window let out a strangled bleed. The old man by the counter mumbled a curse under his breath, but then the attack never landed. Instead, a loud, meaty thud broke through the commotion. Christina's eyes snapped open. The biker's wrist was locked in an iron grip. A hand, strong, steady, unmoving, had caught him mid-strike. Thick fingers wrapped around his forearm, holding him in place like a vice. The blade trembled inches from Christina's chest, useless now, in the grasp of someone far stronger. The biker's eyes widened. He yanked his arm, trying to rip free, but it didn't budge. The grip didn't loosen, didn't even shift. The man who had stopped him was cool and unflappable. He was not young, but sure as hell. His grizzled features were sharp, with years of expertise. His denim jacket stretched across wide shadows on his brow, shoulders, and the way he stood, feet planted, body strong as a mountain. The biker hissed, frustration pouring over his face. He yanked harder, trying to break free from the man's hold. Nothing. It was like pushing against a damn tree trunk. What the hell? Before he could finish, the man released him. Not kindly, he shoved the biker's arm back with such force that the man stumbled, nearly dropping his knife. The biker staggered. Back eyes flickering with confusion, anger surged back just as fast as the shock had come. His face twisted and he spat on the floor. His two friends straightened, cracking their knuckles, eyes darting between the stranger and their leader. The bearded biker's nostrils flared. He wiped at his vest, lips curling back, and then he growled the question that had been burning on his tongue. "Who the hell do you think you are?" The man didn't blink, didn't flinch. He let the silence hang for a second. Then, in that same steady voice, he said, "Chuck Norris," a beat passed. Then the bikers burst into laughter. "No," the bearded one wheezed between laughs. "You hear that, boys? We got a goddamn legend in our midst." The second biker, a wiry guy with too many rings on his fingers, wiped a tear from his eye. "What's next, Clint Eastwood? Going to walk in and back you up?" The third one The biggest of them all just cracked his knuckles. The leader grinned wide, gripping his knife tighter. "Well then, Chuck," he spat, stepping forward. "Let's see if you live up to the damn name a few hours." Earlier, before the shouting, before the broken cups and the burning coffee, before the flash of a blade, everything had been normal. The sun had just started creeping over the horizon when Chuck Norris stepped through the door of Mary's Diner, a little cafe tucked at the edge of town. It wasn't fancy, just a small joint with mismatched chairs and a counter that had seen its fair share of elbows leaning on it over the years, but it had good coffee, and Chuck liked places that felt real. For the last 3 months, while filming a movie in a town nobody had heard of, Chuck had made this place his morning routine. He'd walk in, nod at a few familiar faces, order his usual, a black coffee, no sugar, no cream. Then take his seat by the window at. First, folks had stared when they realized who he was. But the thing about small towns is they get used to anything after a few weeks. People stopped pointing, stopped whispering. He wasn't Chuck Norris, the action star, anymore. He was just Chuck, the quiet guy who liked his coffee hot and his mornings peaceful. Even the staff had warmed up to him. "Morning, Chuck," Christina called from behind the counter. She had a quick foot, a knack for remembering orders, and a bright grin as usual. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, but she never fawned over him like some of the younger customers did, and she never asked for a picture, was simply another typical person. And he appreciated that Chuck lifted his hat in her direction and that she was pouring his coffee before he even got to the counter. She understood how he handled it, and she handed the hot cup in his direction. "You're early today," she said. Rush Chuck smirked and said, "This is the slowest place in town." He accepted the cup and nodded once in gratitude, thinking that I'd get in before the rush. He then carried his cup to his normal seat by the window, where there were regulars from the past. Jim was reading a newspaper in his usual corner, his hands worn from too many winters. Whispering over their pancakes were Earl and Marcy, a couple who had been married for longer than some of the town's structures had stood. It was quiet and simple, with the smell of bacon and fresh coffee filling the air, the radio humming an old country tune outside, and a few cars rolling by, kicking up dust on the road. Chuck leaned back in his chair, allowing the moment to settle. It was peaceful, as only small-town mornings could be, until the door slammed open and the small bell above the door clanged violently, shaking against the frame. A rush of morning air carried the smell of cigarette smoke and leather perspiration into the cafe. 3 men entered loudly, the first of whom was the leader. He had a broad-shouldered face with a wild, disheveled beard and a leather jacket patched with club insignias. His face told a story, most of it ugly. The second had thin, wiry fingers that were heavy with rings, and his eyes darted around the cafe, scanning the space like a scavenger searching for something to dissect. The third, and largest of them all, appeared to have been constructed out of bricks, with knuckles that were guard and swollen. Used to shatter bones, the chamber became smaller as soon as they entered the cafe's warmth diminished slightly as the air grew thicker, but Chuck remained motionless and unresponsive. He had seen enough men and been in enough locations like this, so he didn't need to look like them to understand what was about to happen. He sensed it, and Christina's smile wavered. "Just a bit," she murmured, maintaining her tone as she took the coffee pot off the hob. "Good morning, guys." The bearded person, who was impartial, approached the counter and firmly planted both hands. He grinned, despite the fact that one of his knuckles was raw and still healing from a recent cut. "But this morning, love," he grabbed Christina without showing any kindness. Clenched around the coffee maker, Chuck observed, clearly not directly, but through the window's reflection, the room had become silent, and even old Jim had placed the wiry one pulled out a chair at a nearby table and slumped into it after putting his paper down. Chuck, the larger one, loudly and slowly cracked his knuckles as if he owned the area, sipped his coffee, which was still hot and serene, but he had a feeling that it wasn't. Planning to go on for a while, the bearded man looked around the cafe, his eyes gliding languidly across the faces. His lips extended into a lazy, greasy smirk that made a person smile before he locked upon Christina. Feel unclean simply by being too close to him and hearing his fingers tapping the ground. He drew his voice, as if he had all the time in the world. Christina had been cleaning the floor, and she was laughing. "You're the most beautiful thing I've seen in a long time. Counter." But her mouth tightened for half a second as her hands froze at those words. This wasn't the first time she had dealt with someone like him, so she took a deep breath to keep herself composed. She put down the cloth, ignoring the way he leaned in, but it wouldn't be the last time. The biker smiled more broadly, taking in the sight of you guys ordering anything or just wasting breath. Pushing back, he raised a hand and ran its fingertips over her apron strap. He said, "Perhaps I just enjoy the service here." Christina's hand suddenly flew up and smacked him aside. The motion was swift, keen but in control, not scared, just finished. The man paused, and the smile persisted. However, beneath that was something colder, and his wiry friend with too many rings laughed from "I like it," he mumbled, his seat fiery, and the bearded biker disregarded him. He straightened up and rolled his shoulders, but his eyes were still on Christina, and dark with something she didn't like. As if he was trembling, he reached for her once more with equal ease. When his fingers touched her hip this time, the response was, Christina instantly yanked back so quickly that her heel almost slipped on the tile. I remarked as her hand grabbed his wrist and pushed it, off with greater force than previously. His men's laughter increased when the third biker said, "Keep your damn hands off me." The bearded man's huge one leaned on a neighboring table and smiled, as if this was the greatest show he had seen all week. His face flickered, but Christina could see that he wasn't laughing. He murmured, "Anyway, you have a real attitude, sweetheart." And then just as his hand suddenly sprang forward once again as he spoke, and Christina slapped her palm against his face with a power that reverberated throughout the cafe, causing the whole space to go silent. The pair near the window gazed at Jim as he lowered his newspaper, and even the coffee pot on the hob seemed to be making too much noise. The impact had caused the biker's head to snap to the side, but he remained motionless for a long moment. He simply remained there, breathing slowly and deliberately, before his eyes were no longer playing you a little earlier, and his jaw hardened as he looked back at her. Christina interrupted him before he could finish, saying, "Get out of my cafe." Her voice was steady, sharp, and loud enough for the bearded biker blinked as though he hadn't heard her correctly, filling the space. His pride was blazing, his nostrils flared, and the red mark from her smack was still hot on his cheek. "You're deaf," I yelled at Christina. "Get out." The two other bikers who have been, the wiry one with the rings moved in their seats as they laughed a few seconds earlier, looked to his boss in anticipation of a response, but the large one simply folded his arms and observed the cafe's empty air. Christina wasn't backing down. "You think you can just walk? No one talked. Enter this room and touch me as if I were a roadside pub waitress." Her hand remained motionless as she spat. "I don't give a damn who you are or what hole you crawled out of. You're not welcome here." Rose bowled into a fist on her chest and collapsed, gasping in rage. She didn't care that the coffee still hurt so bad. She just stared straight ahead. The bearded man bared his teeth at the motorcyclist who dared him to try anything. His sides had flexed fingers that twitched as if he wanted to grasp something. But then, as abruptly as his rage had blazed, it subsided, and he rolled his shoulders before turning to face his men. "Well," he mumbled, his voice carrying the same mocking tone, but it had a hint of resentment, and then he smiled. "You're feisty, huh?" "I like that," Christina replied, massaging his jaw where she had hit him. The biker's stomach churned, and he took a step back, raising his hands in a faux submission. "No need to get stirred up, darling." He turned to his guys and gestured languidly. "Come on, boys. It looks like we're not." With a snort, Ed, the wiry one, got up and cracked his knuckles. The large one just looked at Christina for a long moment before he pushed his chair back. Appeared to be finished, but the bearded man stopped close to the counter. His grin had never gone away while he tapped his fingers against the board, but now it expanded wider, and he turned back to face her, saying, "I think I changed my mind," snatched a chair from the closest vacant table, twirled it around, and sat down in it with a slack, haughty attitude. His men did the same, and the wiry one flopped into a seat with this kind of smile. Was all a joke, and the large one sat down, slowly, settling like a boulder. The bearded biker stretched his arms over the chair and slumped back into position. His eyes met Christina's, who was still grinning, and this conversation made me thirsty. Christina stood motionless for a moment, gazing at the man in front of her. "Bring me some coffee." Something in her instincts told her to be cautious, yet, when the bearded. She exhaled slowly as the biker stretched and leaned back in his chair, as if he didn't care. Perhaps he was reversing course because he had enjoyed himself. Small incident, but he was now placing his coffee order. Perhaps this was his method of wrapping things up, without appearing weak in front of his. Christina considered telling the man to go to hell, but she also considered the clients who were still sitting there rigidly. Perhaps it was, as statues waited, to see if this was ended, and without another, she turned, took the pot off the hob, and poured a hot cup of tea. His gaze never left her as she put down the cup and headed back to his table. Before him, and as she raised the coffee pot that was tilted slightly to pour, the biker's hand suddenly exploded out of one. He slapped the cup up quickly and deliberately, and the hot liquid exploded from a piercing gasp came out as the ceramic splashed directly into Christina's chest. Her lips were burned when the heat pierced her uniform, burning her skin. She felt sudden, intense aches radiating over her ribs and stomach, yet she did not recoil. Her breath came slowly and forcefully through her nose as her fingers clenched tightly around the coffee pot's handle. Someone murmured a curse beneath their breath as the diner fell silent. A chair scraped back as a fork clattered onto a plate, but Christina held her. The biker chuckled and shook his head, and he smiled. "Oh, sweetheart." You glanced. The wiry man at the adjacent table chuckled and slapped the person, as if you had to rouse him up. Christina's flesh was burning, but the enormous guy's arm only grinned, refused to show them how hurt she was, instead raising her head with steel-cold eyes. Laughter burst from the far side of her as the searing heat pierced her skin. One of the riders shouted, smacking his knee, but the cafe didn't notice. Even Flinch might enjoy the heat as Christina's breathing became rapid and forceful. Her chest ached, but beneath the sting, a more intense rage burned. With her fingers curled around the empty cup, she ripped off her soaking apron, causing the fabric to strike the floor with a wet slap. Still emitted heat from the coffee it had previously contained, and she hurled it directly back against the bearded biker's dark liquid chest. The ceramic broke. His sneer spread an unsightly stain on his already dirty leather vest. Disappeared. The cafe fell silent, and the elderly man in the corner of the booth gradually. The young pair beside the window exchanged wide-eyed looks as he lowered his newspaper, despite the constant hum of the as if everyone in the room were holding their breath. The coffee maker appeared to dim. The bearded biker flexed his fingers at his sides and looked down at his vest, observing the dark stain seeping into the leather. Before his eyes returned to Christina, his smirk vanished. "Oh, you got." His voice was low and heavy with something repulsive that crawled. "Don't you think that's brave?" Like a slow-moving menace beneath the skin, he took a step forward, followed by another that you truly believe you can mouth. The tense silence was broken by a crisp click as his hand went into his vest and off to me. The cafe's folding knife smoothly opened in a single motion, revealing steel. His two friends smiled as they caught the low light, their bodies twisting coiled in Christina's. Heart was pounding, but she was poised like wolves surrounding their prey. Didn't move. Her hands were clenched so firmly that her nails were digging into the burn on her chest, which throbbed like a fresh wound. Her palms, but she wouldn't give up, so the biker took a sharp breath. Cold terror tore through Christina's throat, gripping her chest in. Her body responded to a cold grip before her thoughts, and her eyes clenched shut in preparation for. Chairs screamed against the floor as the diner burst into turmoil. In a rush of activity, patrons rushed back, and a woman by the window screamed, strangling the elderly guy at the counter muttered a curse, but the strike never materialized, and instead was a bland. Christina's eyes snapped open as a loud impact sliced through the confusion. The biker's hand, as solid and unwavering as stones, had seized the wrist in a grip like forged steel. Thick fingers wrapped onto his forearm, stopping him in mid-strike like a vice that wouldn't release. The blade was in the grasp of someone who wasn't Christina, hovering just inches from her chest and suddenly absolutely worthless. Releasing his grip, the biker's eyes grew wide with surprise, and he wrenched his arm back in an attempt to break free, but it didn't even move. The hand holding him didn't change, and it wasn't even tense. Remained, the man in front of him was not youthful, but he was definitely not frail either. Time had chiseled his features. A weathered cowboy hat perched on a skin that had been deeply etched with lines from experience. A faded denim jacket hung low over his brow, casting a shadow over a granite-like jaw. Spans wide shoulders, and the way he stood motionless and unyielding like a mountain that didn't know how to bow. But he made it obvious that he wasn't just a random bystander. The biker yanked harder this time, his eyes gleaming with knotted frustration. It felt like attempting to wrestle a damn oak tree as he tried to tear himself free. Tree out of the ground. What the devil? The man released the tree not gently before he could finish. Forcefully pushed the biker's arm back, causing the man to stagger and lose his hold on the knife. For the second time, he caught himself just before his knees buckled, causing his boots to skid against the cafe floor, flashed across his face, shame and amazement mingling with anger at the same time. Swallowed it full, his eyes burning with insult behind him, his lips twisted and his nostrils flared as he spat onto the floor. Both of his men tensed up, cracking their knuckles and shifting their weight. Their leader and the stranger exchanged glances as they waited for the next move. The bearded biker's face darkened as he wiped at his vest. Then his voice became low, and he muttered, angry, and asked the question that had been gnawing at him since he was stopped. Who the hell do you believe you are, the man? Because he allowed the stillness to grow without blinking or faltering. Only long enough for the biker to sense it before Chuck spoke in that same calm, unflinching tone. Norris paused, and then the bearded biker's laughter burst forth. Listen, guys, we have a freaking legend in our midst of laughter, a wiry man with rings. Wiping at his fingers was among the second bikers, his eyes like though he had just heard the most hilarious joke of his life. What will happen next, Clinty? Would enter and support you. The third one, the largest of the group, simply rolled his shoulders and cracked his. The leader's fingers tightened around his knuckles as his smile widened. Knife. Then Chuck scowled and moved forward to check on you. The bearded biker stepped forward with bright eyes, up to the damn name. His knife was still in his hand, but it was now hanging at his side in derision. He smirked as he glanced up at Chuck, his sharp edge catching the dim light of the cafe, and down like a guy evaluating an elderly bull that ought to have been released to pasture, he shook his head and scoffed. It's not often you see a washed-up cowboy still acting like a hero. The wiry one laughed while resting on a... The commander pointed his knife idly. The table isn't the movies, old man. There aren't any stunt doubles here to take the hits for you. Chuck's voice was thick. Do you really believe you're some sort of badass? No matter how many times you portray the strong guy on TV, you pull that off with amusement, and you wind up looking like a fucking hog after his two men laughed and slammed their fists. Chuck turned into his hand without responding, flinching, or blinking. He moved away from them and approached Christina, whose skin was red from the reprimands and coffee was leaking off her outfit. Christina shook her head, even as he inquired in a hushed voice, "Heat? Does it hurt bad?" Chuck nodded and got some cold water on her fingers, even though he could see that they were trembling a little at her sides. Was all he said, simply steady, yet the motorcycles behind him had stopped grinning. The leader's hold on his knife stiffened his cheeks as their laughing stopped. Chuck was irritated since he hadn't paid attention or even recognized them, which he could have done aspit in their faces, and the bearded biker's jaw tightened, and then abruptly he swung the blade forward, aiming it at Chuck's. Chuck moved quicker than a man his age had any ribs, but it never got there. Business moving, he moved slightly out of the way, allowing the blade to miss him by an inch. Then he grabbed the biker's wrist in one action, tightly, twisting it, and a terrible crack filled the air as the motorcyclist jerked his arm backward. Chuck snarled in pain as his knife fell to the ground, but he didn't stop there. With a quick jerk, he pulled the man's arm behind his back, causing him to fall against the closest table, rattling the entire cafe appeared to tremble as the biker swore. His face contorted in pain as the two others charged without hesitation, and Chuck pivoted, allowing the wiry one lunge first, with his fists flailing. A moment before the following attack, the bearded man moves to meet it. Chuck's fist could deliver a single vicious blow to the wiry's gut. The biker's body flew backward onto a chair, his folded breath blasting from his lungs, but the huge one was already the largest, heaviest, and strongest of the three. He shouted as he moved. With his arms outstretched, he sprang forward to force Chuck to the ground, waited until the last moment, at which point he twisted and his leg exploded out when his boot struck the large man's chest with a perfectly timed spinning kick. The impact was like when the wrecking ball struck a brick wall. The biker's eyes widened and his whole body swelled. He was lifted off the ground and flung backward, smashing into a broken table. Plates broke, and then there was silence. The large one remained down, while the wiry one was. The leader was still bent over the table, gasping for breath. Chuck took a stride, his wrist aching, his knife someplace at his feet. The bearded man moved slowly and deliberately, his shoulders ragged with his breathing. He tightened, his eyes sparkling with something other than rage as he turned his arm. The kind of anxiety a man experienced when he realized he had just stumbled to his feet after making the worst mistake of his life. But the big one was still down, so he didn't try to attack again. The cafe was really quiet now, so Chuck just stood there waiting. I heard the old neon sign buzzing outside, but no one moved or spoke. Suddenly, one of the patrons, a young woman, scraped a chair across the floor, had been seated close to the door, took out her phone, and a short while after the first cruiser skidded to a stop outside with its red and blue lights blazing through the front as the cops arrived. Windows of the cafe and the wail of sirens receded in close succession. No one mentioned the tension as two officers emerged, their hands already resting on their holsters. The smell of coffee spills and perspiration was still strong in the air. Patrons remained motionless, their hands clutching tables or coffee mugs that had long ago cooled. A bearded motorcyclist was close by, and someone had taken out a phone that was still recording. The door, his breathing was labored, and Chuck's hold on his wrist was still painful. Even more so when the officers arrived and scanned the area. One of them, a graying man with the sheriff's badge, squinted at the three motorbike riders. "Supposing you guys were the bearded guy clenched his teeth as we received a dozen calls regarding a disturbance. Fangs. But the younger police, a burly man with a buzz cut, remained silent. Moved closer and nodded at Christina. "Ma'am, are you okay, Christina?" Swallowed without nodding. and the sheriff's eyes moved to Chuck when I was okay. He recognized the legend in front of him without the need for an introduction. "Something tells me you handled things before we arrived," he mumbled, looking at the broken table, the upturned chairs, and the three. Chuck didn't respond because he didn't have to answer to the sheriff, and the bruised bikers were trying their best not to look at him. Turned to his Ute cuff after letting out a sigh and massaging his jaw. The younger officer entered and removed the handcuffs behind your backs. "Let's go." The wiry biker muttered something, but he didn't resist as he was jerked to his feet. Big One winced, his ribs still aching from Chuck's. Despite the shackles clicking around his ankle, the leader was unique. His eyes never left Chuck's, and there was a simmering venom in them. As he stepped closer, his boots dragging on the ground, the veins in his neck swelled, giving him the appearance of a guy who was not accustomed to losing, and he had just lost everything before. When the officers pushed him in the direction of the door, he leaned in and lowered his voice so that only Chuck could hear. "Old man, you heard me snarling. This isn't over." Chuck didn't flinch or respond, simply gazed, and while doing so, the biker noticed something that made his stomach turn. It was the expression of a man who had already determined how this would conclude. Something cold and definitive. The biker gulped hard, and for the first time since entering this cafe, he wasn't entirely sure what he was doing. After clearing his throat, the sheriff said, "All right, let's move." The officers dragged them outside. The flashing lights vanished as the door SW closed after forcing them in the direction of the cruisers. There was silence in the cafe far away, followed by a slow breath. Christina let out a trembling breath as she stood behind the counter, her hands clutching the edge of. She gazed at Chuck as the adrenaline that had kept her standing eventually wore off. When you looked closely at him, he appeared composed and unfazed by anything. She swallowed the smallest bit and thanked Chuck, who simply nodded without saying anything. With a simple nod, he took $20 out of his pocket and placed it in the tip jar. Without saying anything further, he turned and headed towards the door, but no one stopped him or spoke as he. When he stepped outside, the sun had slightly risen and the warm morning air greeted him. The town continued to move as if nothing had occurred. Life would continue inside the diner, with coffee being poured and eggs sizzling on the. No one in the cafe would ever forget today, even though griddle talks would continue where they had left off. The bikers, the brawl, and the morning Chuck Norris arrived are all things they would never forget, taught a lesson that would never be forgotten, okay, people? That was quite the journey, wasn't it? Now, before we to sum up, let's be clear that Chuck Norris did not actually do this narrative. Enter a cafe in a tiny town and impart life lessons to a group of bikers, but wouldn't it be something that stated that although this story is entirely fictional, there are many lessons to be learnt from it? It's not only about one. It's about sticking up for what's right as a man faces off against a mob of troublemakers. Christina, defending the defenseless and understanding when to fight and when to leave, she refused to allow fear to rule her even. Though she was outnumbered and in actual danger, Chuck was the one who put an end to this drama, even though he didn't initiate the fight, serves as a reminder that genuine strength is about presence rather than just punching. Chuck didn't need to boast, didn't have to prove himself since his deeds spoke for him, and that's what made the bikers understand that they were well above their capabilities. And let's not forget about justice. The police arrived, the life went on after the evil people were taken in, but what transpired in that cafe wouldn't be forgotten. It serves as a reminder that bullies can be replaced, that bravery is important, and that occasionally everything may be changed by the right person at the right time. So what do you people think? Let me know in the comments what you learnt most from this story. Please let me know what you think, and remember to like if you liked this. For more stories like these, subscribe and stay tuned. See you in the following one.